Welcome to video 3 of AI coding for scientists and researchers. And today we're going to be talking about a primer on artificial intelligence, large language model technologies. And this is the third video in a series that shows you as a scientist or a researcher how you can increase your efficiency and get more done using little tools that you can make with AI without being a software developer yourself. Today, the first thing I want to cover is the difference between AI and LLM. So what are these? So AI is the broader category, artificial intelligence. It encompasses a lot of things like machine learning, various, vision of recognizing objects through, a camera and understanding what they are. There's a lot of things that AI covers. And LLM, or a large language model, which is what a lot of people think of as AI, ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, etc. That is one subset of the broader category of artificial intelligence or AI. So what I do want to do is kind of explain what is an LLM, what is a large language model briefly. We're not going to go through and try to understand them from a really deep level, but just high level, I want you to kind of get a broad, understanding of what is happening. So this is a 1970s Japanese pachinko machine, which I thought, I've always kind of envisioned LLM technology as this, and I'll explain why. But if you've never seen one of these, it's like a old school Japanese arcade or pinball machine where you would launch a ball and then it would kind of randomly come down all these various little pins in this thing and fall potentially in one of these places where you'd get more points, and you can kind of win based on a lot of just chance and randomness based on how that ball falls down. And so large language models, it's a really, you think about ChatGPT, it's a really strange thing because it feels like you're talking with another intelligence who is reasoning and thinking. But when it really comes down to it, what an LLM or ChatGPT is a calculation. So when it starts with a word, when you ask it something, it's almost like a metaphorical pinball is coming down and examining all the training data and saying, based on what the user just said to me, the most probable first word in response to that is, and it's examining probabilities of a million different branches of potential ways that it could respond. And it always goes with the highest probability path. And then eventually, after it does that, countless times, it comes down to just a handful of words that it should respond with, each with their own probability. And then it takes the one that is the most probable. That's really all it is every time it's answering a question, it does that a bunch of times for every single word that it's going to respond to. And we're going to talk about, it doesn't think in terms of words, it thinks in terms of tokens. But, and I'll explain a little bit about what that is. But at the end, by doing that countless times, it constructs a sentence that makes sense to the user. And it's gotten better and better at that. And if you think about it, that's kind of what we do, right? Like when you're talking and you want to emphasize a point and you're thinking of just, I just said something and I want to pick the perfect word, and you pause for a second and you come up with that word. You're doing all this intuitively. Your brain is just kind of figuring out what the perfect word is for a given, end of a sentence based on all your training data, your whole life, everything you've ever read and internalized in your brain. That's happening automatically. With the LLMs, it's a much more explicit process where there are these actual probabilities behind each response, but that's all that's happening. So when you are talking with an LLM, it's just a bunch of math equations or probability comparisons that you're not really aware of, and it gives this illusion of sentience that is really quite deceptive. So this is just to illustrate that briefly. And then you come into the prompt, right? So this is a key aspect of anything that you want to do, at least right now with an LLM, is you have to understand what makes up the prompt, which is what you're essentially asking the AI, and what's a token. Now, I will say that, I'm going to show you some code. You don't have to know all this stuff because your AI coding tool is going to do all this for you. but it is helpful for you to know what this stuff is conceptually so that you can guide the coding process and maybe help debug things or really be intentional with how you want your tool to work. And I'll give you some examples of that. But this may look overwhelming if you're not familiar with code, but we're just going to go step by step and kind of break it down. This is some Python code from the actual application that I showed in the first video. So the initial prompt here, I'm setting the prompt equal to this text. Please provide a comprehensive summary of the following research article. I drop in the DOI link, and then it says, focus on main research objectives and findings, key methodologies used, important conclusions and implications, relevance to hydrogen research. So I made that tool as a hydrogen research tool, and I want it to, if I was studying hydrogen, I would do that. But if you study something else, environmental science or health and human safety or whatever, you could change this prompt to whatever you want. You could even make it dynamic so that you can select what the context is. But right now, this is my hard-coded prompt. And then I say, here's the article text. And I just dump the first 4,000 characters of the actual study into the prompt. And I'll talk about why I limited it to 4,000 characters. And then at the end of that, it says, please provide a clear, well-structured summary suitable for a research database. You could say whatever you want, but this is kind of how I'm preparing it to help me with what I'm going to give it. And then here's the call to ChatGPT. So what I'm defining all this stuff in what ChatGPT needs for me to connect to it. And I'm saying I want you to use this model, which is, ChatGPT has a bunch of different options when you're talking to it. And all these different models have different pros and cons. This is just their kind of like base commodity good enough model 4.0, at least at the time of me making this video. And then we have the two aspects of a prompt. And I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. But the system prompt is giving it some background. You're a research assistant specializing in summarizing scientific papers. And then the user prompt is all this stuff that I had up here. And I'm sending both of those to ChatGPT. It says max tokens, which is basically saying, I want you to constrain your response to not just give me an entire book in response. I want it to be kind of short. It's not always going to respect this entirely, but it might be shorter. It might be a little bit over, but that's roughly the guideline for it. And then you have temperature, which is kind of how it gives it a sense of randomness, or you can tweak this based on if you want something more, conventional or something really kind of wild, just random. And so you could play around with that, but this is just set to a temperature of 0.3. And then it just says, get my response back. And then I'm going to do stuff with that in the code. So that's ultimately what this is doing, but I didn't write this. I just had AI make the call to ChatGPT. It constructed all this based on my original prompt to the AI coding platform. So it's kind of like it's prompts all the way down, right? So I just kind of covered that in terms of the system prompt, background context that is beyond whatever, it's like the base level of whatever specific question you're asking. So in this case, I was saying it's an AI researcher. It's helping me understand papers, right? Regardless of what I tell it, it needs to know that's its role. Who should the AI be responding as? What is it commenting on? Who should it be targeting as an audience, etc. So just any like background stuff that you want it to keep in mind. And then you have your user prompt, and this is the specific message that it is responding to. So in this case, here's the paper I want you to study, and here's the question I'm asking about that paper. And then we move on to the context window. This is a really important point because the context window kind of gives you the illusion of continuity, but and I'll talk a little bit about that. But essentially, if you are sending a bunch of text to an LLM in that prompt, that query that I just showed you, that code, let's just say hypothetically that you sent all this text, right? A bunch of text and a bunch more text. The context window is right in the middle here. Like, this is all the AI can actually process. Anything more just gets, ignored. So you imagine for yourself, if I gave you, a 3-digit number, 527, you could probably remember that number, if I said, okay, well, what was that number? 527. If I asked you to add the three numbers together and give me the sum, you could probably do that. But then if I gave you even a 10-digit number, let alone a 50-digit number, you wouldn't be able to probably give me any of the numbers that I gave you. Even the beginning, you might be able to give me the last couple that I said, because your memory would remember these last, you could kind of hear the ending of what I said. But you would just, all that stuff at the beginning would just drop out of your brain. And that's exactly what's happening with an AI. In early versions of ChatGPT, you could be having a conversation and ask it something that you started the conversation with, and it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, because that had moved out of the context window. So all it gets is the most recent stuff. So you got to keep in mind the context window, because different LLMs, different providers have different context windows. And if you try to put too much into it, you're not going to really get it's not going to get the full context of everything that you're asking it. So this is another thing that's kind of a wild aspect of large language models, is when you're sitting and talking with ChatGPT, it's not like you're saying something to it and it just responds, and then you say another thing and it responds to that thing you just said. It's getting the entire thing that you said every single time. And then it says, and the user just asked you this specific thing, right? So it sees everything every single time. And it adds that additional thing that you said and it said to the end of that context window, so that it knows what it just said. But every time you type something to the chat and it responds, it's a completely fresh thing to it. And it only knows what was said before, because you told it what was said before. So if you keep that in mind, that every time you are asking ChatGPT something, you have to send it everything you've said before. Otherwise, it's just going to answer it fresh. So for example, you might say, what's the largest U.S. state? And it says the largest U.S. state is Alaska. And then let's say you ask it again, what's the capital, or what is its capital? If you didn't send this other stuff to it, it's just like, okay, well, the capital of what? I mean, there's a lot of states have a lot of capitals. It doesn't know that you were just talking about Alaska. So you would have to send it this whole thing and say, and what is the capital, what is its capital? And then it would know from the context that you were talking about Alaska, and it would actually tell you the capital of Alaska, because it has that context. So when you're using an AI, coding tool to create your tool, you may want to keep that in mind, that you want to send the context, the past conversation to it each time. And in fact, as I was making the slide, I went and looked at the tool that I had presented in the first video, and I actually didn't even study the code. I just asked it, like, hey, are we sending the additional messages to the chat when I'm chatting with the publication? Are we resending the previous messages each time? It said, no, we're not. So I said, okay, change that, add the previous messages. And it made some changes, and then now that tool is doing that. And so when you're doing something, you probably won't just one shot the tool that you want to make. You'll just ask it to do something. You'll see what it did. You'll ask some questions. You'll ask for some tweaks, and that may be an iterative process until you finally get what you want. And you can do that with these AI coding tools, even if you're not a coder, just by having a natural language conversation with it. So, just make sure you send the full conversation each time if that's what you want, and then you can have a continuous discussion with it. But your tool that you make might not even be a discussion-based application, so you may not even have to worry about that. The other thing, like I was saying, you can only send so much text before stuff starts dropping off at the beginning. And different providers have different context windows. So we aren't talking about an insignificant amount of text. Context windows can range from 32,000 to 1 million plus tokens. And just for some context, like, so that you can kind of place it, I think ChatGPT 4.0, which was in our example code, its context window is 128,000 tokens. A token is roughly a word. It's not quite a word. It doesn't break down by that. Words can change in size. But that translates to, according to this website I found, roughly about 200 pages from a book. So that's quite a bit. So if you have 1 million plus tokens for some of these models, these newer models, or by the time you're watching this video, that might be the standard. It's parsing a lot of text. So you can send quite a bit to it and have it make sense of it. But if you send too much, it's going to not be able to fully comment on it. And even if you're pushing the limit of the context window, I believe I just saw a paper that I haven't read yet, but I think the fidelity of its ability to process really large context windows lessens. So you can't, it's not going to be as good as a shorter context window, even if in theory it could handle a larger amount of text. So just a couple of miscellaneous questions before we end this video. What's an API? We're communicating with the ChatGPT API. Different services that you may use, like, in your day-to-day, if you just type in, whatever tool you like and you type in API, you can see if they have an API. And I think a good way to explain that is, it's like the example of a bank. Like, you don't go to the bank if you want to deposit money and like track somebody down and, say, let's think about the original bank, like, thousands of years ago. There might be some person that you go to and you know him or her and they know you, and you give them your money, and it's like this bespoke process every time. They like to say, okay, I'm going to put this money underneath this, in this place in my house, and if you ever need it, come ask me. It's just like very personal human process, right? That's a little bit different every single time. And so you don't do that when you go to the bank, right? You don't like find some individual person and give them your money and hope that it's the same way the next time. Like you go to the ATM, it's this process that's always the same. You stick your money in the envelope, or sometimes you just stick it right in the ATM, and you just know that money is going to be there when you need it. They'll give you that money back. Like, you have no idea the people that or process that money is involved, or that involves that money after that you stick it in that ATM. And that's kind of like what an API is. So you don't have this bespoke process of connecting to another system. Like, it's just predictable interface that you can do a certain set of things and get a certain, output from. And so that's really what an API provides you. And that's really important, because you're going to be using your AI tool to connect to APIs to get information out of different systems. And then you're going to be connecting with the AI or LLM API, be it, OpenAI's ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude or, Google's Gemini. You're going to connect with their API to do stuff with that information. So it's like APIs all over the place. So it is good for you to kind of understand what that is. That's really the majority of what you need to understand with that. An API key. So in order to interact with these APIs and services, you oftentimes will need to go to the website and generate a special key that you're going to use in your interactions, and that's going to prove that you have access to that. So it's kind of like your ATM PIN code. You walk up, you put in your PIN code, and they know that you are you, and then they let you add money or take money out. So that's kind of APIs in a nutshell. And then you have the programming language. So a lot of people are very, opinionated about what programming language you should be using. Really, it's whatever you're comfortable with, whatever you maybe have some experience with, maybe whatever you aesthetically find easiest to understand. A lot of scientists are familiar with Python just from like basic data processing, and Python can work just fine for a lot of the stuff that you're trying to do. So you can just tell your AI to use Python, and just always use Python. And if you ever hit a limit with what Python can do, maybe you switch to something else. But since AI is doing all the coding and you don't actually have to code, just have it pick something that, you're most comfortable with. So that's kind of everything, that we're trying to cover in this video. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or reach out, teamricochet.com, for any questions or comments you may have. And don't forget to visit our office hours if you have any questions. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next video.